Welcome to the Wolfe Power Club, the weekly podcast where we discuss energy, industry and politics. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Wolfe Power Club podcast. And what a week. It's International Energy Week in London. There's lots of other conferences going on in London as well. But we are delighted to say on the Power Club, as part of our series of the keynote speakers that will be at International Energy Week, we have none other than the CEO of Crystol Energy, Dr. Carole. Carole, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Alex. Thank you very much for having me with you.
And I think why we're excited today, it's fair to say, wherever you are in the world, and Carole has amazing YouTube following, amazing clips. I think what people love about you is you always look at the reality of the situations, practicalities, and don't hold back. Where did this forthright style come from?
Well, I tell you, it goes back to my childhood and where I grew up. I was born in Lebanon during the Civil War. So I experienced things that I don't think many people in the UK or in rich countries, peaceful countries, have experienced. And that by itself made me look at things with a little bit of difference. In addition to the fact that I run Crystol Energy, which is an independent consultant. So we don't shy from describing how things are or what the data is telling us, much more than saying things that would simply please the audience. So, we have to add some spices, right, to discussions.
I certainly got to say, some of my favourite trips have been to Lebanon, and I would say to anyone, a night out in Beirut is something you really can't beat.
Absolutely.
And I would say, to anyone, it's great. But the reality is, for Crystol Energy, this is your hometown. The world of energy is coming, from those who might be national governments through to the latest tech entrepreneurs that see energy as the best platform. So why don't we start with something a bit meaty, though? There's been a huge change in America between the presidential regimes. On one hand, you had the Democrats under Biden looking at reducing drilling licenses, part of the world order. And now you have a new American government under the Republicans with Trump talking about drill, baby, drill. Who do you think's on the right side of the debate here in terms of where's energy transition or goodness for the world? And as we've always said on the podcast, we love all types of energy, but we're interested where you think, as America's such a big player and there will be American representatives here in the Energy Week, who's on the right side of the debate, Biden or Trump?
First, let me start by saying that I think we are aligned in terms of not favoring any particular source of energy, because I'm an energy economist by background, and I cannot focus only on one source of energy without understanding what is happening in other energy markets because of the interfuel substitution. And that's what really creates the energy transition. So I'm glad you mentioned that you don't have a favorite source of energy, because that's how we have a balanced debate. Second, with respect to what you described about the drastic change in the US administration, and we're not talking about any country, we're talking about the biggest economy in the world with the biggest military and political might, and also they are the largest oil and gas producer in the world. So lots of things that make anyone who is analyzing energy markets to focus on what does the change in the administration in the US mean for energy markets. Now, on the surface, when you look at the Biden statements, previous statements, and what President Trump is trying to achieve today, you see them sitting on the opposite sides of the spectrum. The Biden administration portrayed itself as pro-climate change, pro-green energy, and very much anti-fossil fuels, whereas President Trump has clearly said that he loves fossil fuels, that he calls oil the gold, the black gold that they are sitting on. This is an expression I haven't heard actually for a while, and it was something quite shocking to hear a president of a new administration in the US referring to that. You read about it from the 60s and the 70s, but not really in today's terminology. However, there is a big difference between what is being said and what is happening on the ground. And let me tell you this. So the Democrats in general, they tend to present themselves as anti-fossil fuel, but the shale oil and gas revolution would change not only the market realities in the US, but also had massive global repercussions on energy markets, happened under former President Obama, a Democrat. Under President Biden, despite all the aggressive anti-fossil fuel industry rhetoric, and we heard him, for example, describing their high profitability in 2022 as war profiteering, but we saw the US oil and gas production hitting record high. And under President Trump, he is promising us levels not seen before, and he wants to open up more territories for investment. But at the end, it is the market realities that will dictate where investment will go. We are talking about perfectly competitive industry where investors are going to wait for the right price signal to put more money in the sector. It's not because one president says you have to invest, I want to see investment, but let's say oil prices they collapse, they are not going to commit that investment. So at the end, we have to distinguish between the facade, the political facade, and the market realities and what is happening on the ground.
Yeah, I think great answer, and I think also like people always associate the oil industry with him, but also his best mate runs the electric car industry. So you've got to have a feeling that it's going to be a cocktail reactions over the next 4 years. But let's move back to more your home territory. Obviously, Carole, you're respected across the world. I get the impression that Crystol Energy could actually run its business from any country, or especially any energy hub. But you choose London. And this week, a lot of people are coming to London. And I was just wondering why you feel that London is such a good place to headquarter your business, even though I would definitely put you under the bracket of a global citizen.
I'm definitely, when we look at our coverage and the clients that we deal with and all sorts of stakeholders, they are global. But for me, London is home. I mean, yes, I am from Lebanon originally, but I've been living in this country for ages. But what you find here, I mean, in terms of, forget about the taxes. I'm not a big fan of the high taxes we all pay. And luckily, I don't drive a car because of the high bills I'll end up paying every time I visit the petrol station. So I'll have a heart attack. Even electricity is much more expensive than elsewhere. But there's a cocktail of ingredients that makes this place quite special from an investment perspective, a place where you can run your business with peace of mind. Mind you, in many areas around the world, in this industry, the energy industry, you have the issues of poor governance, high level of corruption, weak rules of law. And whereas in the UK, you're really talking about very, very high standards. So you cannot be in a better place to run an energy business, learn about best practice, and not replicate them elsewhere, because I don't believe in one size that fits all. But at least you do have the best examples to show other countries how things can be done. But of course, there are mistakes that can be avoided elsewhere. But you have this kind of stability that you have in the country compared to other regions where you do have, like I come from the Middle East, every day is rather unstable for us, right? But there are things that the UK government can do, and irrespective whether you're a Tory or you're a Labour, there are of course many things that the government can still do to improve the investment climate for companies and investors who are interested in committing capital for the long term, particularly when it comes to policy stability. So that's one risk. People ask me, I mentioned taxes because taxes is one of the areas I specialize in. I say I've been to provinces and to countries, I mean like Norway, for example, when it comes to oil and gas industry. They have some of the highest tax rates in the world, but companies still invest there. Why? Because Norway is famous for having one of the most stable systems in the world. So stability pays off. Stability can be used to compensate for less attractive features that a country might have. So this is one thing I would like to see more of in the UK, more policy stability and continuity irrespective of who comes to power.
Yeah, because it was very interesting. I was at a venture capital talk last night with the Energy Institute, no less. And it was very interesting that, as you said, those pillars of British society, you know, the respect for law, a contract actually has to be held to. And, you know, if it ends up in litigation, that as long as you've followed the contract, you'll be in a good place. The respect to the financial systems, the banking systems. But I do agree with you. I think the big things that the UK, it needs to build on in the next 5 years really needs to be, you know, that sense of a fair taxation system that's steady. I think also is connection to the grid. It's amazing how much frustration was in the room last night. There's all these great green energy projects, or even other types of projects that are frustratingly not getting a connection. And I think we're going to go a bit more into that later on. But where I'm really interested in is Crystol Energy itself. You're the CEO of this great organisation, and obviously there's been a lot of change in the energy markets in the last 5 years. I mean, I think not only have we had COVID, not only have we had political unrest with various different conflicts, but we've also had a very, very different type of legislation. We're getting much closer to like sort of 2030, 2035. And I was just wondering, from your perspective as a CEO, what have been the fundamental changes in the last 5 years?
I'm glad you mentioned the last 5 years, because what people don't realize, and we tend to have our memory tend to be focused only on the short-term incident or things that happened only recently. But mind you, when you look at the last 5 years, I felt like we were living in a crisis souffle, one major crisis after the other. So we had COVID, a crisis like no other, hitting everyone all around the world, and that led to some policies announcement all around the world that still have structural impact in terms of how things are unfolding today and even in the longer term, in the next 5 years or even 10 years. We had geopolitical developments, the war in Ukraine, a major development in Europe. We had wars in the Middle East, Iran and Israel attacking each other directly, something, if you asked me, and I may have said it on TV, that no, I couldn't see that happening, and then it happened. And in addition to that, you do still have lots of instability in other places around the world. We faced inflation, we faced supply chains bottleneck. So you cannot really expect that the demand for the consultancy services and advisory not to change, not to be affected by all those changes. But there are certain things that are still the same in terms of principles. So we talk about advising on how to attract investment and how to have a competitive, globally competitive marketplace. The requirements are the same, but you have to take in consideration all these massive trends that have happened over the last few years. Add to that the energy transition. So here at Open, while for example, we have focused traditionally on the governance of the oil and gas sector, how things should be done properly, minimizing corruption, increasing the benefits to the people, to the society, etc. Now you have the energy transition. Energy transition is not just about putting solar panels on your roof or having wind turbines in your backyard to generate electricity from the sun and the wind. Energy transition is mining and minerals and metals intensive. So when you think about the amount of lithium or copper or cobalt that we need to accelerate the energy transition, we're not talking about few percentage points of growth in the next few years. We're talking really about, I saw some numbers which are close to 1,000% growth rate between now, let's say, and 2040. This is massive. Now, the mining industry, people don't realize, is very similar to oil and gas in terms of principles when it comes to governance, taxation, policy, etc. And actually, the issue of energy security, I keep on hearing everywhere that a green future is more energy secure. We don't have to worry about gas coming from Russia. We don't have to worry about oil coming from OPEC. Well, yes, but you have to worry about those metals and minerals that you need and that are more concentrated in a smaller number of countries than you have with oil and gas. And actually, that concentration is in many countries, in like few countries that rank poorly on political stability and good governance and institutional framework. So the principles that we are dealing with are the same. How do you invest constructively and sustainably? How you improve the governance of the sector? But there is a shift in terms of focus. And also, at the same time, we're not done with oil and gas, for instance. So some of the demands that we are getting a lot these days is what does it mean that suddenly the US is the largest oil and gas producers and they are sending their liquefied natural gas to Europe and they really took a big chunk of the market share from Russia. What does it mean in the next few years for established producers such as Qatar or let's say Australia as competition intensifies? So it's a bit of economic market realities and also geopolitics and governance.
Because I think also really interesting, that leads nicely about geopolitics, is that the United Kingdom, I think, has one of the most complicated relationships with China of any of its trading partners. Massive consumer of Chinese goods. I mean, I used to run a fuel terminal at Southampton ports where 95% of Asia's imports come into the UK. And specifically in energy, when we look at the new government that's come in, they're passionate about solar and storage, and the Chinese have had amazing technical success in solar and storage, not just the technical side, but the cost point they can deliver it at. We've seen that also in various of the AI sectors with DeepSeek coming and showing a new cost model to the world. But we also have the reality of the British-China relationship, a huge fallout on Hong Kong within the last 4 years, where essentially citizens of Hong Kong are seen as a political asylum seekers and can get the right to live and work in Britain above many other nations. We also have this situation where under energy security that the previous Defence Minister Tom Tugendhat had to take serious action when North Sea oil rigs were allegedly attacked by various forces from what they believe emanated from China. Yet the new government is getting very, very close to China. I was just thinking, do you think it's a great thing because it will probably accelerate our solar and storage capability as Britain, or do you think there's a concern with national security with the things I've just raised?
I wish the answer was clear-cut, but let me start from a different premise, right? I mean, we're talking about climate change. If we agree and we accept that climate change is a problem that is faced by everyone on this planet and not just limited to one country, then we have to accept there is a need for greater cooperation between countries. So it's a global problem that needs support and cooperation between different players. And we talk about China. Again, earlier I mentioned the US. Here we're also talking about a key player when it comes to the energy transition, CO2 emissions, supplies of raw materials, etc. for the energy transition. And they do have the capital for investments, etc. So plenty of opportunities in China. And I don't see really like a constructive way forward by leaving China out of the equation. So it's like living in a kind of illusion because China plays a very important role. If you just look at the data in terms of the top producers and consumers of almost every single source of energy, you will find Chinese footprint there. So it's not a country that we can overlook when we're talking about energy, all sources of energy. Now, let me go back to the definition of energy security. Energy security can be provided or secured through diversity and diversity alone. Not only diversity of your sources of energy, but diversity of your trade partners. That is very important. So China is an important trade partner, but would I want to put all my eggs in one country with which I differ on many things, some of the things that you already mentioned, Alex? No, I wouldn't do that. I would definitely try to kind of ride several horses at the same time. So China is an important trade partner, but should not be the most important trade partner for the various risks that we discussed. And the UK definitely can pursue other ventures as they are doing around the world. But allow me here to maybe highlight one issue which may be controversial for some of our viewers and most likely is going to be misunderstood. One of the problems I faced personally, for example, I used to travel quite often to sub-Saharan Africa. So when people then I had during one visit, an official told me bluntly, because you went there it was just after a meeting they had with some Chinese representation. They said, you British should come and preach us about how we should do things. The Chinese don't bother about how we do things. They just sign good deals with us. So this is kind of, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but if you ask me, I think one of the problems I face as a British company, and this is where we kind of tailor our message to our clients' needs and their own cultural aspects as well, is when we try to impose our own beliefs in terms of energy and what should be done on others. We should appreciate that each country has its own domestic conditions, constraints, and priorities. We can show them how we are doing things here in the UK, where we are succeeding, where we are not quite succeeding, but we should not really go and impose our way of doing things on others, because we have different perceptions across the world. And this is one key difference between the developed economies, or I don't even call it global north, whatever, versus the global south or the developing economies. So it's a big controversial issue, but worth keeping in mind when we think about cooperating with other trade partners.
I love this, Carole. I mean, I think forget Energy Week. We need to get you a peerage into the government, some of this rocking and rolling. But I think you're right, because I think that what a lot of people don't understand is when you do travel around the world, is there's not a unified British view or Western view that goes across countries. And I think sort of two examples that I've seen of that, certainly in travels, is my wife loves to go to some of the most remote places on earth. And we went to a salt mine in Ethiopia, very stunning, and Dunnacle Depression. I'd recommend it to anyone. But what was fascinating was the tour had previously been 5 days down to 3 days, because suddenly the Chinese companies that were mining the salt had built incredible road infrastructure that really helped the local citizens. So their feedback was like, yeah, we understand they're mining our salt, but someone was going to. But they've actually given us a road access that benefits all of our subsidiary industries like tourism and so on. And the other bit that struck me, I was, like many visitors to Jordan, I went to Wadi Rum. And our tour guides took us out into the desert, and we're under the stars. I had to ask them, though, on the back of their Hilux, they had an image of all people of Sam Hussein. And obviously, growing up as a kid, that was probably not an image that you'd see on any British vehicle. And they said, this guy stood up to the West. And it was very funny mindset, because I'd never ever heard that growing up in the UK, thinking that actually a lot of people have opinions about us and we need a bit of self-reflection when it comes to international trade. But I like to talk about money on this podcast, and I know that you give a lot of your clients feedback and strategy in terms of this area. And I was just wondering where the finance stakeholders, whether it's the big pension funds, venture capitals, those who just want to invest in energy, what are the opportunities in 2025? Because we know, being International Energy Week, there's a lot of deals done, maybe not on the main speaking sessions, but as we go out to the breaks and we go to the evening parties, we know there'll be various things, various breakfast meetings. It's a very busy time of day, kind of from 6 a.m. to about 2 a.m. every day at International Energy Week. What do you think the financial stakeholders are looking for in 2025?
One of the things, I mean, first of all, stakeholders, they have different strategies and different interests and different priorities. And ironically, for example, if I go beyond the financial institutions, even if you think about some national energy companies from the Middle East, which were traditionally focused on oil and gas business, they are venturing into green energy or infrastructure for electric vehicles. So it's not a clear cut in terms of what category is doing what. It can be actually quite confusing. But in general, I think, for example, in the last few years, we saw a great push towards green energy and less so in terms of fossil fuel. I think probably this year, and we started seeing the cracks in this kind of trend last year or a bit before that, where we see there is more attraction now in the conventional sector, because it goes along this change in the rhetoric globally and the sentiment. There is less appetite. I'm not saying there is a reversal, but just like relatively speaking, that we had this kind of boom, this kind of a strong sentiment that everything is going to be green, 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 and goodbye oil and gas, for example. I think we are seeing more of rebalance in terms of where you are putting the money and where would see sustainable returns in the long term. And one of the issues behind that is that in many places, if not most of the places, green investment requires government supports. Everywhere I go, on every single panel I participate in, where I'm moderating especially, and I ask about a question on policy, what, for example, various investors would like to see. They say, we'd like to see more incentives from the government. And I say, if all of you go, whether you are solar or wind or hydrogen or I don't know what, you go to the same poor government which is indebted, which is struggling to raise taxes to make more money, which wants to kill oil and gas, which generates lots of revenues, and you all want incentives, then you should be worried, because the second you're going to see government struggling, your industry will suffer or your investment will suffer. So that's the reality, and that's what we are seeing today, that there is less and less appetite to give more generous support or incentives to certain sectors. And this is what I meant in terms of rebalancing, in terms of where you should put your money. I think there is an opportunity, and there are opportunities across the spectrum of sources of energy, but it varies between the country where you are committing your money into, and also your perspective. Are you looking for immediate short-term returns? Are you looking for something for the long term? And what is your risk appetite? So that's why we cannot group all the investors under the same umbrella, but it's much more diversified picture I'm seeing today than when I saw over the last few years.
Fantastic, and I'd really agree with that, because I think that essentially what we're seeing, and I think we'll see in London this week, is probably some big announcements, but I do have a feeling that there's been a domino effect. Governments suddenly don't have the money because across the world they had to bail out COVID. The kind of honeymoon period post that sort of bailout has hit home, and suddenly they have to actually fill the reserves, and the numbers have been done, and therefore subsidies of all industries, but especially energies, are critically looked at, saying, is that a fundamental role of government? And then, surprise, surprise, you come back to what is making profitability in, between now and the next 4 or 5 years. And therefore, you can see that sort of domino effect. Now, before we go into our quickfire questions that we ask all our guests, some of us are going to be lucky enough to be in the auditorium to hear your keynote speak at International Energy Week. But for those who are not in the auditorium, what is the best way to work with Crystol Energy, keep in contact with your company, and what are some of the great services you can do?
You can always reach us. We have our contact details on our website, crystolenergy.com. I'm also quite active on social media, so you can always reach out. And if I don't answer straight away, don't be offended. I always respond, even if after a few months' time. It's just the reality of social media. And what we do really, we just tell you how things are from the data that we are analyzing and from our international experience working across the board with many stakeholders. So we don't only work, let's say, with governments or with investors or with companies. We work even with the NGOs and the academic institutions. All these that tend to be left out from this debate are all playing an important role. And we try to give an objective advice supported by independent research and also training to complement what we are doing, because from experience, especially in some parts of the world, in the poorer parts of the world, there is no point of giving a very glossy report with all these flashy figures, and you hire a very sophisticated graphic designer. You can give them that report, but if they don't have the skills and the knowledge to implement your recommendations, your advice is not going to get anywhere. So this is why in many countries, especially in the developing countries, what we do, we complement our advice with training to ensure that the advice we provided is going to be implemented. And if there are things we missed while we shape that advice, we can modify it along the way.
Brilliant. I certainly think, with some of those forthright opinions you've shared today, your clients are going to be happy. So
I'll give you a commission.
We go into our quick fire questions. I think maybe have a little thing. I know we both talked before the interview that we both have daughters that hopefully one day will be in the energy industry. But I was just interested in these quick fire, so just quick answers. Where would you advise people to invest their money in the energy industry today?
I don't advise them where they want to put their money, where they should put their money. If they want to put their money in one sector or in one project, I can advise them whether it makes sense or not. And I look at it not only from one country's perspective, I look at it globally, where it would be better to commit your money if you want to put this amount of money in a particular project.
The next question is, and obviously I've got you penciled in to join this government at some point, but what would you want the government to achieve in the next 12 months?
I really would like to see a greater policy commitments, not short-term fixes. I'd like to see something for the long term, because that's the best the government can do that would compensate for lower taxes and many other things. Stability would give investors confidence to put money in the country.
And then what would you like customers to do? Because I think quite often you see mainstream media have a go at governments, have a go at energy companies, but ultimately we are a reflection of what the customer base wants. What would you want the customers to do in the next 12 months?
I think they should focus a lot on improving the efficiency of their own activities and how they can reduce their consumption of energy, and not to expect quick fixes, because the harsh reality is that the world is not going to be full of green energy overnight. It's a very long-term, complex process, and unfortunately, we have to accept the volatility is part of the process. So what you can do today, think about ways to improve the efficiency, the way you use and you consume energy.
Dr. Carole, I think we can say a huge thank you to you.
Thank you.
I think for our listeners today, we've seen a CEO of one of the leading energy consultancies really cover the fact that if people are big players in the industry, find a safe way to do business with them. We found a way that actually don't just rule out energy sources because you have a personal opinion, but actually look at the transition, how it helps. And ultimately, let's get some stability, let's get some growth, because I think it's an exciting week. We're in the hometown of Wolfe Power Club and Crystol Energy, so let's do lots of deals this week in International Energy Week. I'm really looking forward to your keynote speech later on today, and it's going to be very, very exciting. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Alex. Take care.